Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention we're going to take questions at the end of all the presentations in the chat box. To access the chat box, there's a little icon at the bottom that looks like a talking bubble. That should open up your chat box on the side. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Dertine. I'm a PhD candidate in wildlife biology here at Clemson University. Thank you for attending our webinar on our draft conservation plan of the Kawasi Basin and Congaree Biosphere Region. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box as part of the WebEx app, or if that doesn't work, email me at jdertie@clemson.edu. I'll be monitoring my emails, and we will address them at the end of our presentations. First, I want to just introduce the team that's been working on this conservation plan. Dr. Rob Baldwin is a Dow Chair, Professor of Conservation Biology here at Clemson. Dr. Marzi Motalabi is a Professor of Ecosystem Economics. Dr. Brandon Peoples is a Assistant Professor of Fisheries Ecology, and Dr. Daniel Hanks is a postdoctoral researcher in Dr. Baldwin's lab. That's me, Jeremy, working on conservation planning and biodiversity modeling. Carl Urita is a PhD candidate with Dr. Motalabi, working on ecosystem services. Kyle Brum is a master's candidate, working with Brandon Peoples on freshwater ecology and conservation planning. And Lucas Clay just completed his master's with Dr. Motalabi. Portions of our presentations are recorded just to make sure they're seamless transitions, since all of us are in different locations at this time and want to use our time as wisely as possible. So we'll start off with Dr. Baldwin talking about the background of the plan, and then toss it over to Dr. Motalabi on ecosystem services. Thank you again.
Hello, my name is Rob Baldwin. I am a professor of conservation biology at Clemson University. I've been involved with landscape scale conservation planning in Canada, the US, Southern Appalachians, India, and within South Carolina. In the summer of 2016, I got a call from a wonderful gentleman and Clemson alum, Angus Lafai of Milliken Forestry. He introduced me to the Kawasi Basin Task Force, representing the beautiful, Y-shaped area in the heart of South Carolina. We got a whirlwind tour of the basin, bouncing along with Billy, Kate, and Angus on back roads. And I got to meet Dick Watkins, Hank Stallworth, Stuart White, Mary Crockett, David Shelley, and others whose lives had been dedicated to the conservation in the Congaree watery and santee. We got amazing stories and insight into this diverse and under-the-radar landscape with so many profound natural and cultural features. We could see why the task force was motivated to protect the green heart of South Carolina, as John Seeley termed it. Around the same time, the landscape conservation cooperatives of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began to release their multi-state maps of conservation priorities. My student, Paul Leonard, developed a conservation plan for the Appalachian Landscape Conservation Cooperative, a 14-state region. Appalachian stakeholders appreciated and understood the value of this big picture view and the science behind it. But when it came down to decision makers on the ground, the maps were still too broad. For example, in the Tennessee River Basin, where aquatic diversity is so high. We heard the same thing from our new friends in the Kawasi Basin. Extensive maps and plans were too coarse in scale to help them to understand where they should be thinking about new priorities. Also, typical conservation plans did not include such economic models as ecosystem services, although the Nature Conservancy had provided a nice model elsewhere for water. The trade-off in spatial modeling is making maps that cover a large area, using more general data versus more specific local maps. Most data for broad conservation projects are derived from Landsat, models of ecosystem integrity, and socioeconomic data from sources such as the U.S. Census. For an area as local as the Kawasi Basin, we felt that what was needed was a way of bridging the gap between large spatial models and local knowledge. We find this is true across the nation, that big multi-state planning projects were great in focusing attention on parts of the region that should be prioritized. In fact, the Kawasi Basin turned out to be a big priority for the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Blueprint. Within these priority areas, however, local decision makers need more local information. So taking all of this feedback into consideration, economist Dr. Marzi Matalibi and I wrote grants in 2017 to begin a planning project for the basin in a more fine-scaled way that integrated economics and ecology. With the help of many of you who wrote letters of support, we were successful in getting funds. We thank the USDA and NRCS for their support. One thing that changed along the way was that in the fall of 2017, the National Park Service and UNESCO were successful in having the region designated the Congaree Biosphere Region. Biosphere reserves are a global phenomenon to help protect resources by developing plans for sustainable economies surrounding national parks. At that meeting, I met John Kupfer of USC, who has taken a leadership role in the CBR. Since the Biosphere Reserve encapsulated the original Kawasi Basin Task Force planning area, as well as Fort Jackson in Columbia, we decided to expand our study area. The research we are presenting today represents efforts by many people over 4 years, funded by the USDA, as well as the Margaret Lloyd Endowment, whose property, Hardscramble, is within the Biosphere region. The students presenting today have spent the past years gathering data from people and places within the region. Many of you have interacted with them, answered their surveys, supported them with meals, housing, and talks. We thank you for that. They have attended national workshops and applied what they have learned here in the basin. 4 master's and PhD projects and a postdoctoral fellow have been focused on the Kawasi Basin. Even so, we recognize the limitations of the project. We have imperfect information, and as with most studies at this scale, have made assumptions to cover gaps. The science is thus improved by repeated feedback loops involving the very decision makers who make conservation decisions in the region. So this has been a collaborative effort from the beginning and continues to be. Whether you are an expert in conservation modeling or in the natural and cultural history of the region, we are asking for you to be engaged after the webinar and thus improve the effort. We will be soliciting your ideas and input. For that purpose, Dr. Hanks has created an innovative web mapping application for you to use at the end to give us your feedback. So please stay tuned. Thank you very much to all of you, many of whom are conservation heroes, to whom we all owe very much. We hope this science improves how you are able to carry out your plans. Each of the talks that follow is being presented by the student who conducted that aspect of the conservation plan. First, we have more introductory material from Drs. Marzi Matalibi and Daniel Hanks. Marzi will talk about ecosystem services, and Daniel will discuss systematic conservation planning. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Marzieh Motalabi. I'm an assistant professor at Clemson University, Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation. Today I will be talking about the value of ecosystem services. What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem includes all of the living organisms including plants, animals, and people in a particular area interacting with each other and with the elements of the non-living environment such as earth, soil, and climate. Ecosystems provide us many ecosystem services. How do we define ecosystem services? My favorite definition of ecosystem services provided by Dr. Daly in 1997. She says, ecosystem services are the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005 grouped ecosystem services into four broad categories. One of the categories is provisioning ecosystem services. Provisioning ecosystem services are the values products obtained from an ecosystem, such as food, water, minerals, and energy. The other type of ecosystem services are regulating services. Regulating services are the various benefits that come from the regulating of ecosystem functions and processes, such as carbon sequestration, climate regulation, water purification, and flood mitigation. Another ecosystem service is cultural services. Ecosystem cultural services are the various non-material benefits that we gain from ecosystems, such as spiritual and historical experiences, recreational experiences, or cultural experiences. The last type of ecosystem services are supporting services. Ecosystem supporting services are the various services that are necessary for the production of all the other ecosystem services, such as soil formation or nutrient recycling. Why do we care about the value of ecosystem services? I'm an economist and I care about the economic value of ecosystem services and ecosystem functions. In my opinion, ecosystem values are very important. The economic value of ecosystem services describe the importance that is placed on ecosystems by individuals, which includes not only income generated from using ecosystem services and goods, but also other benefits they provide for human welfare. We need to quantify ecosystem services values because many of these services are not traded in markets and hence don't have prices, and therefore they are interpreted as having no value when it comes to making decisions about their use. In other words, markets fail to incorporate the full economic value of ecosystems in pricing and decision-making mechanism. Information about ecosystem services values will help decision makers about whether convert or conserve ecosystems. In next video, you will learn about how benefits from ecosystem services, how benefits from best management practices worked for New York City and saved residents of New York City tons of money. Thank you.
The world is diversely composed of many different ecosystems. These ecosystems provide mankind with benefits in the form of ecosystem services. When we hire someone to repair a sink or wash our car, we pay them for their service. Just as people provide services for others, nature provides services for us. But what does nature ask in return for these services? Right now, nothing. All of these services we get for free. In the early 2000s, New York City faced a freshwater crisis. The fresh water needed for consumption by 12 million people was compromised by pollution and environmental degradation. The poor water quality was negatively affected by the lack of ecosystem services in the area, as well as the lack of biodiversity. A major decision had to be made to address the water quality problem. One of the options was to build a treatment plant. However, it turned out that it would cost as much as $6 billion. This did not even include the annual operating cost of $300 million. Another option was to clean up and restore the environment by making sure that the ecosystems remain intact and conserved.
This entailed rehabilitating the degraded ecosystems, buying land to expand the protected areas, and encouraging stakeholders to employ conservation practices. The environmental restoration cost New York City $1 billion, spread over 10 years. One main practice was to rehabilitate wetlands areas, since wetlands purify water by removing chemicals from the water, a significant and advantageous ecosystem service. Although it had a longer time period of implementation compared to the treatment plant, the overall cost was significantly lower than the treatment plant. Additionally, the benefits gained were not only water purification, but also improved biodiversity, increased wildlife, and better overall quality of the environment, and provided more opportunities for aesthetic value and outdoor recreation. The people saw the benefits and were in favor of protecting the watershed, as it was a cost-efficient option and it provided many long-term benefits. A win-win situation. In land use decision-making, such as watershed management, most often we are more concerned with the economic benefits. Also, we typically weigh our options by using an economic, or more specifically a monetary compass. With this in mind, we often neglect the value of the ecosystem services that we may lose in exchange for a specific decision. But if we account for the value of the benefits that we get from nature, using the concept of ecosystem services, we can see that the most valuable thing that we can do is to protect the environment and include ecosystem services in our decision-making processes.
Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Hanks, and today I'm going to be talking to you about systematic spatial conservation planning. Why are we developing a spatial conservation plan in the Congaree Biosphere Region when there are other plans like the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative's Blueprint and the South Carolina Conservation Bank Conservation Priority Map that already encompasses the biosphere? The reason is really a question of scale. What scale works best for conservation to make the most impact through stakeholder engagement and on-the-ground conservation efforts? Different biophysical processes require a range of spatial and temporal scales, whereas reproduction occurs at one spatial and temporal scales, climate change occurs at quite a different scale. We need planning to span these scales. However, through a planning effort we did for the Appalachian Landscape Conservation Cooperative, branded Naturescape, we heard that much of the plan didn't work for local stakeholders. It was too coarse. We believe that the spatial extent of the biosphere region is an appropriate geography for optimizing conservation efforts. There are multiple tools that we use as conservation planning that incorporate our understanding of ecological systems and operate within the constraints of our socio-political systems. Systematic spatial conservation planning is just one of those many tools that conservationists use to accomplish their goals. So what is systematic spatial conservation planning, and why is it needed? Systematic spatial conservation planning is a quantitative approach to systematically assess potential conservation actions and provide informed decision-making power to stakeholders. It is needed because ecological patterns and processes occur at and are being impacted at the landscape scale. It helps us achieve conservation goals while considering that threats that can hinder those goals. Collaborative input from a variety of stakeholders is a hallmark of systematic spatial conservation planning, and a key factor that sets it apart from other conservation planning approaches is that it uses mathematical solutions to find optimal spatial configurations to complex spatial problems. The overall goal of systematic spatial conservation planning is to provide a system of managed and protected areas which are representative of socio-ecological important species, ecosystems, cultural resources, and ecological processes, all while considering that the future is both dynamic and uncertain. Including all aspects of our conservation goals across space and time is a difficult task. We use the word CARE to help us remember the fundamental principles for a systematic spatial conservation plan. In doing so, we hope to protect biodiversity, the livelihoods of people who depend on it, and a specific quality of life. A plan that adheres to the CARE principle is connected, adequate, representative, and efficient. A connected plan allows for species to travel unimpeded, or relatively so, across the landscape to ensure long-term persistence of the full range of species habitat needs. In other words, it allows biophysical processes and habitat requirements for a variety of species, different life stages, to be linked together across the landscape. An adequate plan provides enough protection of species and their required habitats to ensure their persistence through time. A representative plan captures and protects all of the species and habitats present and further ensures this by including their spatial replication. And finally, in an efficient plan, all locations taken together achieve the goals with the least cost, thereby reducing the impact on people while meeting the objectives of the other three components. Now let's take a look at an example. If we consider a hypothetical example where we are interested in conservation of an adequate system, of an aquatic system, you see that we have a single target, suitable spawning substrate, and protected riparian areas all along a stream network. In conservation planning, we need to break the landscape up into some definable spatial units. Here, you see hexagons, but this can also be represented by watersheds, for example. So in the example here, we have 24 planning units, 1 target species, and 3 habitat requirements. Now let's take a look at the spatial relationships of our species and physical habitat. You'll notice in the upper section that in the headwaters there is a suitable riparian areas and substrate, but the downstream dam acts as a barrier to the connectivity of required habitat for the fish species that we are interested in protecting. In the lower portion of the figure, you'll notice that there seems to be no barrier to fish movement into the headwaters where spawning substrate is located. There is an agricultural facility that could act as a barrier due to possible runoff, but the riparian area is protected, and so, in this hypothetical example, it does not act as a barrier to fish migration. Whereas in the upper portion of the figure, you will see a planning unit with an agricultural facility and no riparian protection, resulting in fish being unable to make their way to the next planning unit, regardless of there being a dam there. So what should we protect? It seems reasonable that we should protect the lower stream section that connects all of our biophysical requirements for this simple aquatic example. But what happens if we begin to add other targets? So now let's consider an example with 4 targets. You can see that it becomes a much more complex planning situation. Recall that adequate means that we need enough of each species and habitat type to ensure their long-term success. Here, we should also consider potential impacts from stresses such as land use and land use change and climate change. Remember, we want to maintain connectivity for our aquatic target and associated habitat requirements. Additionally, for our plan to be adequate, we now need enough of each species and habitat to ensure their long-term success. This requires a good knowledge of the spatial requirements of all the targets. You will notice that in our connected aquatic plan, the planning units already contain some representation of the other targets. Maybe we could start by simply looking at the number of targets represented in each planning unit. What if we decided to protect the planning units with 3 or greater targets? This example shows only adequacy in terms of the species being represented within the planning unit. However, it does not indicate if their habitat requirements are needed, nor does it consider connectivity. What if the bird target what if a bird target were to be endangered species? We probably would want to consider conserving all of the planning units where it is known to occur. Now that our plan seems to be connected and adequate, we want to ensure that all species and habitats that are present in the planning region are represented and spatially replicated. So in addition to the current area proposed to be protected, we need to ensure that the special bog habitat in the upper right of the region is also conserved. Because the future is uncertain and unpredictable, the spatial replication built into the plan, where species and habitats are replicated in more than one planning unit, helps protect against various forms of disturbance or catastrophe. For example, natural disasters or changes in land use that can be catastrophic for our conservation plan are mitigated against by this spatial replication. In the example here, we lost one of our bog habitats to a natural disaster, and 2 planning units with our endangered bird were lost to development. However, each have been spatially replicated, and so they can persist within the region. At this point, we need to work towards minimizing impacts our conservation plan has on people and try to mitigate potential conflicts that can arise between livelihoods and conservation, including those livelihoods that depend on conserved biodiversity. We need a spatial plan that is efficient. For example, we might want to consider providing space in our plan for a neighborhood near the recently developed urban area. Additionally, due to limited conservation funds, we might want to consider removing from our plan 2 of the protected planning units where our protected bird species is found. Due to our spatial replication, however, we still provide protection to nearly 70% of the planning units with our endangered bird species. Our plan is now connected, adequate, representative, and efficient. Let's take a look now at another example where your job is to identify the smallest number of planting units while conserving all of the identified targets. In this simple example, by ensuring all targets are met, we are being representative, and by selecting the fewest number of targets, we are being efficient. I'll give you 10 seconds to come up with a solution. It might seem sensible to select the planting unit with the most targets represented, which would be planting unit number 1 with 8 targets. In doing so, however, you'll notice that there are 2 targets yet to be protected, the gopher frog and the eastern diamondback. To protect these 2 targets, you will also need to select planting units 3 and 5. This is often the result of spatial overlay models where the spatial unit with the most targets or layers is prioritized. However, recall that we are also trying to be good stewards of our conservation resources, so greedy is not good. You will now notice that if we select planting units 3 and 5, and while each has only 5 targets, we reach our representative planning plan while being much more efficient. The examples I've shown in the presentation are simple examples, but the difficulties become apparent when you start to consider a large spatial extent and many more targets. In the plans that you will see presented hereafter for the Congaree Biosphere Reserve, there are as many as 7,901 planting units and 11 integrated features and targets. Because of the exponential increase in complexity with additional planting units and targets, we rely on computer software programs aimed at creating a spatial plan that is connected, adequate, representative, and efficient.
Hi everyone, my name is Carl Loretta and I will be discussing the process of ecosystem service modeling that we did in the Congaree Biosphere Region. Picking up from Dr. Motalabi's introduction of ecosystem services and the video explainer, we know that ecosystem services are vital in our well-being. With this, since diverse ecosystems thrive in watershed, therefore there is a direct relationship between the state of the watershed, ecosystem services, and human well-being. However, with the increasing demand and economic activities, this threatens the watershed land use and practices, hence affecting also the health and integrity of the ecosystem services, and eventually human well-being. So what we are proposing is to develop a PES in the Santee River Basin Network, or SRBN. Basically, in a PES, ES providers ensure continuous provision of the ecosystem service products by maintaining healthy ecosystems through conservation practices. In exchange, ES beneficiary supports the providers by compensating their efforts for ensuring continuous provision of ecosystem services. The ecosystem service modeling research is part of the systematic approach in designing the PES in SRBN. The Congaree Biosphere Region, though, is within the SRBN, hence making the results also applicable to the region. In order to design the PES, we systematically conducted considering 4 key characteristics towards a good PES design. Firstly, it should be stakeholder involved. So we conducted a perception and preference survey to 1,500 South Carolina residents on their priority ecosystem and ecosystem services. The results revealed that stakeholders' priority ecosystem services are water-related ecosystem services, particularly in terms of improvement to water quality. Secondly, a PES should have an established scientific linkage. We used an ecosystem service-based landscape model to quantify the ecosystem services across the SRBN landscape, including within the Congaree Biosphere. We focused on 2 selected specific ecosystem services which were identified from the stakeholders' preference survey. First is water quality through sediment retention modeling, and water supply or the water yield through the water yield model. The sediment delivery ratio model estimates the amount of sediments being exported to the stream with and without land cover. Therefore, the difference is the sediment retention capacity. Higher sediment retention capacity implies better water quality of streams and rivers. On the other hand, the water yield approximates the amount of runoff that each land cover provides. This could eventually contribute to the stream, could be as either water supply in the long run, or it can also contribute to erosion or flooding, since this is a quick flow. Therefore, lower quick flow implies better water quality and lower probability for flooding, and also more infiltration for vegetated areas. The list of data inputs used in this model includes high-resolution raster files, particularly DEMs with 3x3 meter resolution. For ease of processing, we resampled all data inputs to 9x9 meter or 81 square meter per pixel. We used the crop data layer of 2018 with detailed classification of crops to account for the different crop management factor index for the agricultural land. Now, thirdly, PES should have a systematic analysis of value. We conducted a valuation of stakeholders' willingness to pay to estimate how much do they value each of the ecosystem services using a choice experiment method. So we surveyed 1,500 residents using a choice experiment. Each resident is given 4 sets of choices with 3 options to choose from. And each choices, the attribute of the ecosystem services changed along with the corresponding cost, giving us the information for estimating their maximum willingness to pay. Finally, an integrated results allowed us to create an index of the level of ecosystem service provision per pixel. So we took the results of the carbon sequestration model developed by Mr. Lucas Clay, another researcher under Dr. Motalabi and Dr. Baldwin, which focused on the value of carbon in the forest ecosystem as ecosystem services. They published their paper and we have referenced it here. For easier interpretation, we aggregated the ecosystem service values into 1 acre per pixel. This yielded us a raster file which indicates where are the areas that provide high overall amount of ecosystem services. This was then used as an input to the Markson model for the conservation planning in the Congaree Biosphere Region. Now, let's look at the Markson objective function. The Markson equation works by adding the value of each Markson terms per planning unit. The cost term represents a measure of constraint. It could be cost of operations, opportunity cost, legal restrictions, or anything cost-related or value-related. In our case, we use the ecosystem service index values and reverse the function so that the software will consider that highest ecosystem service values will be treated to have the lowest cost for conservation. Secondly, the boundary term represents a weighting factor on how much important the boundary of a feature is relative to the cost. This has implication in terms of connectivity between target conservation area, and this is where the target goals can be set. Next, the penalty term is intended to account for the level of conservation in the system as conservation features. The conservation feature penalty factor, or CFPF, is a weighting factor that determines the relative importance for reserving a particular conservation feature. This is where the features are included and can be set to be locked in or locked out. Finally, a different cost threshold is a penalty applied if the target cost is exceeded. Overall, the optimal solution tends to find the areas where the target goals of conservation features will be met. These conservation features will come from Jeremy's and Kyle's research, which they will talk in the next videos. Considering all these conservation features, the optimal solution will also look at considering the lowest possible cost, which was derived from the ecosystem service values from this research. So let's look at the results. Now, in quantifying the ecosystem services, particularly in the sediment retention model, we see here that the vegetated areas are where the highest amount of sediments are being retained. Also, upstream areas have higher sediments being held as compared to downstream. Therefore, this implies that if you have highly vegetated areas upstream, it also follows that few sediments will flow towards downstream, hence maintaining the integrity of the ecosystem and ecosystem services. Now, looking at the numbers, we see that majority of the sediments are retained by forest land, the dark green, both in overall and per unit area contribution. Furthermore, in the per unit area contribution, we show that in general, vegetated areas, grassland, the light green, wetland, the blue-green, and the forest land, the dark green, provide significant sediment retention capacity, including actually the agricultural part, which is the yellow. On the other hand, non-vegetated areas behave otherwise. Therefore, the model shows that vegetated areas, particularly the forest land, provide the most of the ecosystem services that we receive in terms of sediment retention capacity. Hence, we can associate that to improvement of water quality. Now let's look at the water yield. The models show that the large amount of quick flow are being contributed by the gray areas or the urban and developed areas. Note that this water is a runoff or could be a runoff to the stream. Hence, looking at it also on the total, we can see that forest and urban areas are the land cover that contributes most of the runoff. However, consider that forest is the vast majority of the land area. Hence, it will really contribute a lot in total. But for urban areas, which only accounts for 13%, but considering the amount of water that it contributes, this implies that a substantial amount of quick flow or runoff is associated with the urban land cover. Also, looking at it on the contribution per unit area, we can see that the non-vegetated areas such as the urban area, the gray, idle cropland, orange, and the barren land, the brown, have the highest quick flow contribution per unit area. Therefore, also consider comparing it with the vegetated areas, which is the agriculture with yellow, forest, grassland, and shrubland, we can see that the vegetated areas have lower quick flow per unit area. Therefore, the model shows that vegetated areas provide most of the ecosystem service benefits, particularly from water yield or quick flow perspective. Vegetated areas holds quick flow, hence implying better soil quality and also better water quality. Now let's look at how much people value these ecosystem services. The results of the choice model shows that residents are willing to pay for the improvement of ecosystem services, particularly for water quality and for wildlife. Now, in terms of water quality, since residents in South Carolina are more familiar to cover crop rather than agroforestry, they associate the improvement of water quality to cover crop. Hence, we see that their willingness to pay is actually higher than for agroforestry. However, in terms of wildlife value, since agroforestry has forestry in its name, forests are more attributed to improvement of wildlife habitat. Hence, stakeholders have higher willingness to pay to agroforestry than cover crops. We also see here that those who were subjected to cover crop as an intervention are not willing to pay for the improvement of water supply, but are willing to pay a small amount if the intervention is through agroforestry, since agroforestry intervention is tree-based, which we know has an impression that can have higher water supply contribution as compared to a crop-based, which is the cover crop. Now, considering the number of households in South Carolina as of 2018, overall, if we use these values and compute for the potential revenue that can be collected, this could amount to $11 million to $14 million per month, which is a very substantial amount to support conservation program. Now, finally, with all the information from the ecosystem service values and ecosystem service quantification, we generated a map that will identify the hotspots for high value of ecosystem services. At this point, we focused only on the Congaree Biosphere Region. We took the results of the INVEST models from the water yield and sediment retention model, and also included the carbon model from Mr. Lucas Clay's research. And following the ecosystem service index that we used, we normalized each ecosystem service values results and added all the normalized ecosystem services to show the aggregated ecosystem service index scores. This shows the areas where the ecosystem service provision yield the highest. The map shows that the blue areas or closer to the blue areas shows the highest areas of ecosystem service provision. It is not surprising to note that the areas with highest ecosystem services are those in highly forested areas and adjacent to the highly forested areas. The Ecosystem Service Index raster will be used and integrated into a Markson software for determining spatially optimized conservation areas together with other features in the Congaree Biosphere region. The Ecosystem Service Index raster will be used and integrated into the Markson software. Higher ecosystem service values will be treated by the software to have lower cost for conservation. Hence, it will be desirable for the spatially optimized conservation plan. Now, together with consideration of other features in the Congaree Biosphere region, which will be discussed in the next videos by Jeremy and Kyle, this will form the spatially optimal conservation areas brought by the Markson software. Now, what are key takeaways? The continuous provision of ecosystem services are highly affected by the state of the forest ecosystem. Vegetated areas also provide the most ecosystem services, therefore, implementation of sustainable farming practices such as cover crops could be highly beneficial. Also, residents are willing to pay for the improvement of ecosystem services, particularly for water quality and wildlife habitat. Now, the potential revenue that we can get from the stakeholders' willingness to pay can substantially generate sustainable financing for conservation programs. Finally, the integration of ecosystem service values can determine a holistic perspective of where the best areas to invest into strategic environmental management programs. Now, all this information seems to indicate an ideal scenario which leads us into a conservation plan. Maraming salamat po. Thank you for everyone for listening, and I would love to answer your questions, and you can also contact us in these details.
Hello again, this is Jeremy Dertine. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation. I contributed the terrestrial biodiversity data models for this conservation plan, so I'm just going to quickly introduce those to everyone. We went with three different types of data, biodiversity data, for this particular analysis. First was a multi-taxa species richness. Then we developed focal species connectivity maps for three different focal species of the area. And then we also used an SCDNR Natural Heritage Program Endangered and Threatened Species data layer. Also ongoing for future work, I have a 120-point count data analysis for communities in the CBR. Unfortunately, that field season was canceled this year, but the analysis is ongoing and hopefully will be coming out shortly. So for the species richness, we worked with colleagues at North Carolina State University and acquired predicted habitat maps for amphibians, breeding birds, mammals, and reptiles for the CBR. This came out to be 344 different species with different habitat maps for the area. We used raster calculation and calculated all of the overlaid all the layers together to get species richness of these three different groups. And this is just examples of three different bird habitat maps, gray being where there'd be predicted habitat, potential predicted habitat use of the birds, black being where the habitat was not suitable. So these were the species richness maps for the four different taxa. As you can see, the darker blue is the highest species richness, and then going into the light whitish yellow where there's lowest species richness for these classes. You can see that for both amphibians, birds, and reptiles, there's a clear correlation with the Kawasi Basin. It's not too surprising, especially for amphibians and reptiles. However, mammals, we see that the species richness is quite diffuse across the entire study area. Some correlation to the Kawasi Basin, but not the same as the other three classes. Now, species richness is useful for patterns of biodiversity. It's far from a perfect index, as some species may be more important than others, but it at least gives us a baseline for a biodiversity index, which is important for determining the best locations for conserving wildlife. The next layers we used were known as connectivity layers. Now, many of you know that healthy wildlife populations require connections between important habitat patches. And in places such as Columbia and the surrounding communities, human development is really starting to fragment these habitat patches. Now, similar to the predicted habitat maps from the gap analysis, we can create species habitat use maps and then use electrical circuit theory to see how wildlife may actually move across the landscape, just like electricity might move across a surface with different types of resistance on it. We chose three different focal species for this analysis: black bears, northern bobwhite, and North American river otter. Given limited resources and time, we can't model all species, and so we try to choose species that could act as an umbrella for several different species and or are charismatic species that are of interest in the area. Now, to create the resistance layers for these three focal species, we began by collecting species detections from online databases of observations from researchers, scientists, and citizen scientists that had GPS locations of actually seeing these species. These were used in program Maxent along with several different variables that represent different aspects of the landscape or abiotic or biotic factors in across the geographic distribution we're interested in. Not all of these variables were used for each species, but this is the totality of variables that I isolated for use in modeling species distributions. This species distribution map was then also combined with a weighted overlay with roads to add resistance of species actually having to move across a road and the dangers that might entail. And this created these species resistance layers. So since this was the species resistance layers for most of South Carolina, it includes the Piedmont and the southern coastal plain.
as a part of the distribution. The green being the areas with the least resistance for wildlife movement, and red being the areas for the most resistant to wildlife movement. You can see that black bears and river otters have pretty similar resistance patterns, where northern bobwhite almost seemingly the opposite, except of course for the city centers. These layers were then the intermediate stage to go into programmed circuitscape, which actually sends hypothetical electrical current across the resistance layer. And this hypothetical electrical current acts as how either an individual individual species might move, such as bears, or in the case of bobwhite, it may be more population over time to show how genetic movement may occur. So, as we can see, and not too surprisingly, black bears are very tied to the core habitats within the Kawasi Basin, but we can see their lighter movement starts to emerge on the northwestern side of the watery as the bears are trying to move out of the Kawasi Basin. Bobwhite, on the other hand, are kind of the opposite, of course. They like some more of the open habitats, forest and edges of habitats. So we can see they really are moving through the Fort Jackson area, predicted-wise, and kind of are bunched up between the growth coming from the southwest or from Columbia towards Camden, and then the watery. And then the otters, not too surprisingly, are within these riparian areas between Congaree to Fort Jackson, and then the watery. And so then finally, we also included this layer from the SCDNR Natural Heritage Program. The red hexagons in this are areas where there are federal or state threatened endangered species, and the yellow being nature serve or nature conservancy globally or state imperiled species. So after introducing these, I'll now throw it over to Kyle, who will discuss his aquatics model, and then we'll go into the conservation plan.
Hey everybody, my name is Kyle Brum. I'm a master's student at Clemson University, and my portion of the project was in developing the aquatics model for the draft conservation plan. I think this figure in itself does a really good job of showing how all of these different ecosystem types fit together and contribute to supporting ecosystem services, which, as Carl mentioned, has a very direct bearing on human well-being itself. And so it's important to consider, the terrestrial as well as the aquatic ecosystems and really kind of maintain them in their highest functioning state. So our first step was to go all throughout the Congaree Biosphere Region and collect our raw data. And so we started this in the spring of 2019, sampling aquatic insect communities. And you can see this map on the right. We sampled streams from really small headwater streams all the way down to these larger kind of river systems like Gills Creek and Sandy Run, for example. And these, sampling protocols that we used, it was really hop into a stream and sample everything that looked like good habitat, which in the natural streams tends to be a lot of wood cover and undercut banks with exposed roots. And in some of the more urban streams, you get kind of these novel habitat types like old, tires and things like that, for example. And so it's really just kind of, sample what's there and identify everything that we find, everything that we collect. And so we backpack electrofished for the freshwater fish communities in the summer and fall of 2019. Our next step, once we collected our data and had a chance to identify all the individuals, we calculated 4 different measures of biodiversity for our macroinvertebrate, our aquatic insects, and our freshwater fish communities. And so the first measure of these was really just taxonomic richness, right? How many unique species did we find from each stream? And then the second measure is a little bit more complex. We call these indices of biotic integrity. You might have heard of them before. But these really help us to evaluate the response of a local community to pollutants and stressors. And so are we finding, a lot of tolerant species or a lot of sensitive species that might be indicative of some novel pollutant, some source of environmental stress. And then the next two get into kind of these functional components of biodiversity. The first one, functional diversity, really has a basis in the species traits and the species niches. And so these, kind of speak to things like functional feeding groups and habits. So how do these species, move around their system? Are they swimmers? Are they predators? Do they filter water to clean it and, get their source of food? How do they kind of go about, how do they contribute to the nutrient cycling and overall functioning of the system? And then functional redundancy is also important to consider. So say you sample a community and you find, a lot of spotted sunfish, red ear sunfish, pumpkin seeds, and bluegill. You might end up having a high taxonomic richness, but since all those sunfishes kind of have the same role in the community, they're all, pretty functionally similar. You might end up having low functional diversity and high redundancy, right? So the point is you can have all these different aspects, and they, depending on how you actually calculate biodiversity, you can get pretty different results. And so now that we've collected our data, we've calculated our raw individual metrics for estimating biodiversity, we then develop predictive models that help us kind of visualize and predict biodiversity and how it is actually distributed throughout the Congaree region. So to do this, we broke our stream networks into these individual catchments. So every stream segment, all the land draining to that individual stream segment is what we term a catchment. So then we were able to go through and calculate these independent environmental predictor variables, right? Things like land use, the surrounding geography, elevation and slope, variables related to in-stream connectivity, whether they're natural dams or, human erected dams within the stream network. And so these were really, these allowed us to associate our biodiversity metrics, right? Do we find higher metrics when we have forested land and low dam density, for example? And in doing so, we ended up with these prediction maps. So for aquatic insects, for example, we have our 4 metrics, and we have, a gradient from high to low values for richness, integrity, and our 2 functional components as well. And I won't spend too much time talking about the patterns that we see here, but I do just want to point out that when we compare these aquatic insect prediction maps to the ones for freshwater fishes, we see a pretty high level of complementarity between the two. These will be on the website if you want to take time later and compare them or have any questions. So since freshwaters are flow connected, right, stressors or pollutants that come into a stream can flow downstream and affect communities, potentially miles downstream. It's important to take that flow connectivity into consideration. And so in order to do that, we had to develop an independent prioritization just for the freshwater data set. And right, so this was done using MarkSan as well. We took all 4 aquatic insect layers and all 4 fish metrics into account. And this is really showing us the highest priority areas to conserve areas with high aquatic biodiversity. So we see, Bates Mill, Sandy Run, Halfway Swamp Creek, and we see some pretty good areas up here by Camden as well. To make that map a bit more manageable and a bit more usable, we took the 60th percentile for those priorities. So we really just kind of zoomed in and focused on the best of the best. And then we converted this priority map to the hexagonal data structure. And that really helped us to integrate this freshwater model with the terrestrial model and the ecosystem services models. And then lastly, we imported a data set that came from the Department of Natural Resources Natural Heritage Program. And this represents sub-watersheds where we found threatened and endangered aquatic species. So these are pretty important to consider, being, both federally and state listed T&E species. So we threw that in the mix as well. And now that we've covered our ecosystem service portions, as well as our terrestrial and aquatic models, I'm going to introduce and kind of show you guys how we went about integrating all of these three components together into the final draft conservation plan. And so the first step in this Marksand model is to set these goals. So you can think of this as how important or how heavily are we going to weigh a certain feature. So for these freshwater priorities, since we'd already kind of simplified them by going through a Marksand model, we put a bit of a higher goal there. And then our richness estimates, where we took 60th percentile values just to kind of focus on the best areas and represented them with a 25% goal. And we did the same for the remaining layers. I do want to point out this is probably one of the more subjective aspects of developing a conservation plan. And ultimately it comes down to, what are the stakeholder values within the area, right? So there's a lot of room for feedback on this portion of the project, especially. We can ultimately choose to be more conservative or more strict with what we define a good value. If we want to increase this to, say 80 or 90 percentile, we'd have a lot fewer values and maybe kind of focus in a bit more. So that's kind of just one of the tuning aspects. So keep that in mind. And then the next step was we took areas that were already protected. So this is kind of in blue, this is kind of our baseline protected area network. And so it's important to, consider areas that are already under protection, being in the national park or in Fort Jackson military lands. And then when we run our Marksand model, these are always going to be selected. So the model itself will kind of try to build around this and kind of try to connect portions of the current protected area network. And then by locking out certain areas like this, main corridor from Lexington to Camden, these are just, urban areas where conservation efforts are not feasible. Our next step was to pull in all of those layers, all of our different target percentages, and develop the Marksand model. And so this is the result from the Marksand model, and this is the current draft conservation plan. And so we see in green, these are the highest priorities for the region. We see kind of coming through the middle of the watery side. And I'm just going to point out one quick aspect. We see that the freshwater priorities that we originally developed, they come out, they're all pretty well represented, but they're all fairly low priorities within the final integrated model. So I think this just tells us that as far as the freshwater conservation efforts go, there's a lot of different options, and there's not necessarily one area that stands out from the rest. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Jeremy, and he's going to dive a little deeper into this integrated conservation plan, and we'll keep moving forward with it.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. So here is the our draft systematic conservation plan. I decided to display and navigate to show everyone it in our stakeholder input application map that we've generated. This application has the plan, several boundary layers, and all of our input layers for you to navigate through. It's also going to allow you to create points and polygons and answer just a couple questions to give us any constructive criticism or comments about things that we might be missing, or other things that you might think are important for the next iterations of this plan. So once again, this map is attempting to meet conservation goals most efficiently by protecting habitat patches while showing preference to land patches that provide the best ecosystem services and encouraging some clustering of the planning units. The dark green areas are the areas that are showing the highest priority, going to medium green, then that light yellowish color being the lower priority habitat areas. The computer program runs 100 iterations trying to create different conservation plans meeting the same goals, and then it adds all of those iterations up together, and the ones that were chosen 100% of the time are the ones that we now see as the highest priority in those dark green, or they're areas that are already under some sort of protection. Before I break down some of the bigger picture items of this plan, I first wanted to just point out once again the sheer amount of area within the Congaree Biosphere Region that is already under some sort of protection. That's that darkish blue color. You can see Congaree National Park is obviously down here. Fort Jackson, large amount of area under a form of protection, and then all the different areas, conservation easements or heritage reserves within the Kawasi Basin. It's just a sheer testament to the conservation partnerships that already have existed within this area for quite some time. I also wanted to address the aspect of this portion of our conservation plan not being included within, even though it's a part of the Congaree Biosphere Region. So technically this area drains into the lower PD River, believe it or not, and even this small sliver goes to the lower PD and not into the Wateree and the Santee. Since we were sticking within the Santee watershed for several of our data input layers, that's why that portion of the biosphere is not in it, and why our study area isn't exactly the same as the biosphere region boundary. So the first big picture item about the conservation plan is this large portion of high priority section on the southern part of the Kawasi Basin focus area. As you saw, much of this area is already under some form of protection, so it makes sense that the model is trying to close in the gaps that already exist that are relatively simple compared to the other sections that are very, very open and much more difficult to create large cores of protected habitat. So that's not to say that all these areas are possibly available to be protected, or that it's absolutely mandatory that all the areas are protected before moving on to something else. But it is important just to see that we know ecosystem conservation, some of the best conservation happens in these large cores of habitat, and that this could be your best bang for your buck when it comes to trying to protect future land areas. The next big picture item to look at for this conservation plan is this inverse sea connectivity that the plan is trying to create. There's already a pretty strong connection, from Congaree National Park all the way up the Wateree because of the conservation of the Kawasi Basin focus area. And areas such as the Wateree Heritage Reserve right in this area and the conservation easements surrounding it to its west already are beginning to make a connection to Fort Jackson Army Base. However, some of these areas that are under some form of protection or near form of protection are showing up as really high priorities to create a buffered connection between Fort Jackson and the Kawasi Basin focus area. I think this is a really neat aspect, really important aspect of the conservation plan. It's also showing that its preference for picking these areas to the south and southeast of Fort Jackson with high ecosystem services valuation. So by creating this strong connection in the uplands to the west of the Kawasi Basin focus area, moving down towards Congaree National Park, and then of course like the Ponset bombing range, you're creating connection between multiple types of habitat, and especially between the uplands and the bottomland hardwood forests. So those are two of the really big picture items that are showing up from the conservation plan. Some of the smaller things to point out: the high priority near the watery village, at the kind of the elbow of Watery and Congaree in the Kawasi Basin. This is creating a larger buffer in this relatively narrow area on the eastern edge of Congaree National Park. And some of the high connection of this is also coming from the high connectivity values for the bobwhite as they move into this upland area along this ecotone, this forest edge. There's also a broader lower priority, a little less selection or direction given within these working lands in the uplands and just to the west of the Watery and the Kawasi Basin focus area. There are several riparian corridors in this area, including places like Tom's Creek, which would be some of the higher priority areas to focus on due to their biodiversity and freshwater community conservation needs. One more note that we wanted to point out was this orange corridor that I've placed here. Though it wasn't selected as a part of our efficiency plan, because our goals were already being met in other places, we view that this Cedar Creek corridor is really, both Kyle and I both repeatedly came back to it as a biodiversity connectivity importance, and also due to having several species of interest or concern from in the freshwater community. So obviously Cedar Creek is also an important ecotourism aspect for locals and visitors alike, and it's a priority in Kyle's aquatic model, but and in the decades moving forward, especially as there's increasing land change coming from Columbia, it could provide a natural visual break into the working lands that could be conserved in this lower priority part of the conservation plan. So providing this protection of this riparian corridor could be very important, not only for the health of the wildlife community, but also for the health of some of the socioeconomic factors that are important for this region. So those are a few of the major takeaways from this plan that we wanted to point out. The next thing we wanted to do was now show you how you are able to give us suggestions and comments for the plan and into the next iterations of this plan. Okay, so I've been showing the conservation plan using, like I said, our stakeholder input map application. And so you've seen me turn on and off layers. You can do this yourself in the layer list in the top right. You can click on that and then use these two arrows, drop down, and you can actually see all the layers that we used as inputs into the Marksand model. So let's say you're really interested in the reptile species richness from the gap data analysis. You can click that on and it'll actually show the reptiles richness per hexagon across the entire study area. And then you can also turn off the other layers above it. You can think of these as layers of the cake if you haven't used this type of GIS application before. Layers sitting on top of them, and so once you click those off, it exposes the layers below. And so for these reptiles, you see that the darkest blues are the areas with the highest species richness, going to the reds with the lowest species richness within that hexagon. These, of course, aren't the totals for species richness in the area, just that one hexagon. So turn that back off. Turn the conservation plan back on. You may have also noticed that in the middle of my previous presentation I switched all of a sudden to a world imagery, a satellite imagery. You can turn that back off and go to the original base map that we had. I had added that world imagery by going up to this add data, clicking on it, and then actually just searching world. And I knew that it was world imagery, so that's why I found it quickly. You can also remove that from your map if you want, or add it back in. Close that up. The overall legend is this button right to the left of the layers list. This shows the full legend of the things that are on the map right now. This is the conservation plan, once again 100% being the highest priorities, and then these lighter colors being the lowest priorities, and we're not showing ones below 5%. So here then there's the most important aspect of this. This is where you are able to provide us comments. In a typical setting, when the workshops we were planning, we were going to have huge printouts of these maps where we could use Sharpies and add lots of comments. But in this case, we're going to be using these digital maps. So you can click the Smart Editor. Say it's a point that you just want to point out to us. Maybe it's over in this aspect of the eastern side towards Sumner of the Quasi Basin. You can click on it. It'll generate a point. You can give us your name. Or maybe there's a name of an expert that you think is more important for us to contact. Your contact email, the expert's contact email. This is important for our record keeping and future work that we're trying to accomplish. What plan are you commenting on? Or what input are you commenting on? Most of what we're looking for is input comments on the conservation plan itself, but maybe you have comments on a terrestrial thing that I'm missing, or you think would be very important to add, or aquatic or ecosystem services. And then we can direct the query or comment to the appropriate person. And then you could say, this is really important for XYZ species. Then you can hit save. So if you want to add another one immediately, you actually have to hit cancel here. It'll solidify that point there. And you can see it turned green because you commented on the conservation plan, also called the integrated plan, because it integrated these three aspects. And then if you can actually now click on it, and you can see your name, your email address, what plan you inputted on in your comment. So let's say it's actually a larger area that you're interested in giving a comment about. You can click on, once again, under Smart Editor, New Feature. And then you can actually draw a polygon. So I'm not holding the button down, I'm just clicking once again, then double clicking. And that actually then draws a polygon over a much larger area. Once again, I can put my name in, contact email, and then it's important to once again tell us what plan you're commenting on. Let's say it's on the terrestrial input. Maybe it's another thing about a species input that might be missing. So we do terrestrial input, and then you provide some comment, hopefully, and then hit save. So now you've generated a polygon and given us also more comments on that. And once it's deselected, it'll actually be orange because it's on the terrestrial data input. So this was the main way that we are looking for comments from the conservation stakeholders in the area. You'll be able to access this stakeholder input map by following the website that's in the agenda on the WebEx meeting. If you need that link, feel free to email me. This will be the web page that we've generated, where you can get more information on the terrestrial models, ecosystem services models, the aquatic models, the integrated plan itself. We're soon to have a longer tutorial on how to use this web map than what I'm talking about right now. And then there'll also be a link to this webinar that we're recording. So now to get to this map, you can just click on stakeholder input, and it'll open up a fresh one of the maps. Okay, so thank you very much. That concludes our webinar. So we're now going to go over some of the questions that we've been receiving in the chat.
Okay, this is Jeremy again. Thank you, all of you, for sitting through all that information. Obviously, and at a different time, we were hoping to present in person and have a very long workshop where we could present all of that information. I'm about to put the link up for the map in the chat box, but if there is any other questions this time, if you could type them in. I don't think we actually have any other. So what's the next step? So the next step is really to receive feedback and hopefully create a better plan that can be implemented by land trusts in the area, and hopefully hopefully in the future more collaboration with local governments and other private entities. But really, truly, the next step is to get all this feedback in and produce reports that the local entities can use. Is there anybody else on the team that would like to add to that?
Hello, everyone. This is Rob. I just want to iterate what Jeremy said, that this is not a plan that represents any decision-making entity. It's information only. So we know that there's important stakeholders throughout the region, donors, governments, so on, that are interested in this type of information. We're now collect feedback. Might those entities develops future iterations of these.
Thank you, Rob.
And to add to Rob's point, this is Gordon High, and this is part of our deliverables to South Carolina NRCS and USDA to generate this interactive stakeholder map for this region. And then we are going to expand it hopefully to other watersheds in South Carolina.
Got it muted.
Iterate what you said before, and to be clear that in this phase, you're able to give us feedback, both written feedback in the chat, as well as you can go to the map itself and put points or draw a polygon. It's actually pretty easy. Even I could do it. And then it'll ask, there's a little box that will come up where you can write comments in. It's kind of cool, but you feed feedback in either way. If this experience thing isn't working because of a computer connection or whatever, feel free to just write what you want into the comments section. Thank you.
I'll also put on my email up again, and feel free if you just have other general comments and you just want to email them directly to me. Feel free to do that as well. Well, thank you all for your patience through this technological difference. We really appreciate any feedback on both the plan, and if you also want to email about this webinar and how we conducted it. Obviously, the bandwidth issues at the beginning on several different people's sides were part of the reason why we wanted to actually record it. Since we did about 7 different transitions through the presentation, we didn't want to rely on 5 or 6 different internet connections to make sure that we didn't waste any time. The recording will be accessible in the next couple days at the ArcGIS Experience webpage that was one of the 2 links that I also just put up in the chat box. That link is also in the agenda for this WebEx, and I can email it out again to the email lists that we've been using, a couple email lists that we've been using. Okay, thank you very much.